Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Kara, and thanks to the University of Alberta for hosting us tonight. And I think what we just heard is that without the vision of working with the private sector to commercialize technology, the success of our oil sands in general and Syncrude in particular would not have been possible. So how about another big hand for our hosts here at the University of Alberta? And I'm delighted to be joined by Ministers Savage, McIver, Nixon, Copping, and Pon, MLAs Yao, Smith, Armstrong, Hamanyuk, Turton, and Wren, and I think there might be others coming and going throughout the course of the evening, but I want to thank all of those representatives of government for being here, and all of you folks for celebrating a red letter day for Alberta and for Canada in one of the most impressive technological, economic, and ultimately social achievements in our country's modern economic history. 3 billion barrels achieved in a technology that just decades ago people thought was impossible. And we overcame the impossible. You overcame the impossible, Syncrude, through the resolute application of a spirit of innovation with research, huge investments in research and application of technology to help to fuel our prosperity. So I'm here on behalf not just of the government of Alberta, but 4.5 million Albertans to say thank you. Thank you to the visionaries behind Syncrude and behind our oil sands to being true leaders. 3 million barrels, that is, by the way, let me also say, Doreen, thank you for that tremendous tour through all that you've achieved, but also thank you for your generous gifts tonight to both the University of Alberta and Careers the Next Generation. So 3 billion barrels is a pretty impressive number, but it is actually pretty small in the context of 166 billion barrels of proven and probable reserves. And let me say how fortunate we Albertans should be to know that we have inherited the world's third largest proven and probable reserves of accessible hydrocarbon energy on the face of the earth. And we are recovering that energy now after the decades of Syncrude's innovation, thanks to many remarkable people. In a story that's worth recounting, we've heard some of it, but let's cast our mind back to the early 1970s and the consortium that included Imperial Oil, Gulf Oil, City Service, and the governments of Ontario, Alberta, and the federal government. The deal-making involved in those days involved a lot of drama. In fact, Peter Lougheed went on to say that it was the reason for his gray hair. But he succeeded in getting Pierre Trudeau's Liberal government to buy 15% of the equity and allow oil sands crude to be sold for the then world price of US $20 a barrel instead of $6.50 under the federal price controls of the time. Still, there was a lot of criticism over the Lougheed deal. My friend, the Alberta Liberal leader at the time, Nick Taylor, the ever acerbic wit, compared the oil sands companies of the 1970s to, quotes, a boarder who marries the landlord's daughter, stops paying rent, then gets the first pork chop and the best bed in the house, unquote. He always had a colorful way of putting it. Less humorously, the CBC made a scurrilous docudrama about the deal that was so full of misinformation and disinformation that my predecessor, Peter Lougheed, sued. He won $15,000 in an out-of-court settlement and a groveling apology issued twice on the national news. Sounds like a good idea to me. Anyway, that's when we had governments that stood up for this industry in this province. But when Syncrude's plant opened in 1978, it was the biggest project in provincial history at the time and one of the biggest industrial projects in Canadian history. It would not have been possible without the brilliant work of scientists, here at the University of Alberta and at the Alberta Oil Sands Technology Research Authority, AOSTRA, which was a key part of the Lougheed government's plan to make the oil sands commercially viable. Project Energy Breakthrough, the Premier called it. Among those who built on the pioneering research of the legendary Alberta petroleum scientist Carl Clark were Syncrude founding president Frank Spraggins, Imperial Oil chemical engineer Clem Bowman, Alberta Geological Survey geologist and foremost oil sands expert Morris Carrigy, former U of A Dean of Chemistry Harry Gunning, and Alberta Research Council head Ernie Wiggins. How about an applause for all of those and so many others who led the way? The province's investment in Syncrude was through the 50% Crown-owned Alberta Energy Company, and Albertans were given preferential access to the first offering of public shares in the AEC, and many would agree it was the best investment we ever made. Chief among the economic and social benefits generated from the project were the good jobs it provided for people from across Canada and all around the world, more than 200,000 of whom have been employed over the years as workers and contractors by Syncrude. And let me pause to say that while the scientists and the executives get noticed in the history, that none of this would have happened without the working women and men who brought to the oil sands their get-her-done attitude, who applied millions of person-hours of labor to build these huge projects. And we should never forget that it was the working women and men who actually made all of this possible. Now, since 1978, you just told us that the Syncrude has paid $11 billion in royalties. It was 11.5. I was the guy who said thank you. But if you add on to that the taxes, I'm told the total royalty and taxes paid by Syncrude since 78 equals $21 billion. Syncrude, the women and men behind it, have helped to build schools and hospitals, infrastructure, care for our seniors, and provide for the least fortunate. You have been a great engine, not just of our prosperity, but of our generosity. You have helped to make Alberta one of the most prosperous and generous places on earth. So 21 billion times over, I say thank you. And we hope to get billions more in the future, let me be honest. And you've spent $64 billion on goods and services, I'm told, including $3.5 billion with Indigenous companies and contractors. In fact, Syncrude, and you've mentioned this, Syncrude has become one of the largest employers of Indigenous people in Canada. At fully 10% of the company's workforce. And Eric, you told me you're going to share with me how you got that started, the ball rolling on that, because that is the next wave for us in this industry. It's how we're going to get pipelines built. It's through Aboriginal participation. That's why we've created the Indigenous Opportunities Corporation, a $1 billion backstop, so that our First Nations people can have a real ownership stake in the development and shipment of the resources that lie below the lands that their ancestors first inhabited. Thank you to Syncrude for being a real leader in that. On top of all of that, the company has made massive and sustained investments in researching and developing technology to produce oil with ever lower emissions and improve environmental protections. And we know that that is now more important than ever. And we're looking forward to working with Syncrude and our other oil sands operators to show the world that we are producing energy at the highest, not just human rights and labor, but also environmental standards on Earth. And I know that many of our operators have the aspiration eventually, with technology, to become net zero carbon producers. And I believe that by applying the same spirit of innovation in the future that developed this resource in the beginning, we will get there, and we will beat the world on any metric of environmental or social or government standards in development of energy. We'll do it. In fact, Syncrude owns, I'm told, holds 227 Canadian patents and has planted 10 million trees and shrubs. I wonder who's counted all of those. And 39 hectares of mined lands have been reclaimed. You know, I don't know if some of you have heard when Rex Murphy comes out west to give his oil sand speech, he always says that they took him up north to see some of the Syncrude operations, and they showed him this, bison herd and that forest and these reclaimed wetlands. And after half a day, he said, "This is lovely, but do you have any oil up here?" So we're all proud of what you've done on the environmental side, a record that is a tribute to high social and environmental standards upheld by many people, past and present, including leaders like Eric Newell and Jim Carter, and Syncrude's current managing director, Doreen, and we're just so proud of your leadership. Syncrude was also supported, and I want to make this point in a nonpartisan spirit, supported by Jean Chrétien's Liberal government during the 1990s when the Prime Minister and his Energy Minister, Anne McClellan, is Anne here tonight? Unfortunately, she couldn't make it, but I want to single her out for having worked with Alberta's then Klein government to help the operation during a tough price downturn. The 1995 National Oil Sands Task Force pulled together both levels of government, industry, unions, and suppliers, and as a result, Alberta adjusted royalties while Ottawa enabled faster write-off of capital investment through the accelerated capital cost allowance. This set the stage for a huge increase of investment and growth in the oil sands after the turn of the century. So in absentia to Anne McClellan, thank you for what you did for Albertans, and to our current Prime Minister, please remember, it was two previous Liberal governments that helped to make all of this possible. We hope that yours will too in the future. I put that positively. I put that in a positive way. To everyone involved, thank you for your commitment to Alberta and to Canada. The oil sands are truly a national treasure. Alberta has 12% of our population, but thanks in large part to what Syncrude and others have done, 25% of investment in this country. And of course, Alberta's energy wealth has enabled us to provide so much to the rest of the country. $200 billion in the last decade alone, $600 billion since about 1960. And we're not done yet. So together we will work to tell our remarkable story of innovation, of environmental progress, of social generosity. But tonight is a night to look at the past and say, well done, Syncrude. Well done to all the women and men who have paved the way to a bright, prosperous, and generous future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Premier.